The strangest part of the Templar story is not that castles stayed standing in Portugal, but that the church destroyed the order almost everywhere and still allowed survival there. If the Templars were truly too corrupt, too dangerous, or too heretical to exist, why did their men, wealth, and military system avoid total erasure in one kingdom? That question matters more than any single fortress wall because it points straight at motive, and motive tells us what the papacy actually needed. Somebody powerful decided that total destruction cost more than carefully managed survival, and that decision was not random. The answer begins with a tension at the heart of the whole crisis, because Rome needed the Templars gone as a scandal but still useful as trained military power. This story unfolds through 8 clues: the suppression itself, French pressure, Portugal's frontier needs, the fight over property, the new order of Christ, and the deeper logic behind them. First, the Templars were suppressed, but suppression is not the same thing as proving every single Templar personally guilty in the same way across every kingdom. In 1312, Pope Clement V dissolved the order through the bull Vox in Excelso, ending the temple as an institution inside Latin Christendom. Historians often describe that move as administrative and political as much as doctrinal, shaped by scandal management and pressure rather than by a clean universal verdict. That difference opened a narrow door, because Rome could kill the Templar brand and the Templar corporation without saying every trained knight had to disappear forever. That narrow door becomes more important once French power enters the picture, because King Philip IV of France was pressing the crisis hard. Philip IV had anger, influence, and strong reasons to break a wealthy international order that stood outside easy royal control. Debt, power politics, and the chance to crush a rich transnational institution all pushed Philip toward destruction instead of rehabilitation. In France, the anti-Templar proceedings became brutal and theatrical, with confessions, accusations, and public pressure shaping the atmosphere around the case. Clement V therefore faced a dangerous balance, because openly saving the Templars risked a deeper clash with the French crown, while erasing everything created other problems. That is why Portugal matters so much, because Portugal did not share the French king's exact motives and had practical reasons to resist the French model. King Dinis of Portugal had used the Templars in ways that were real and concrete, not romantic or symbolic. They helped in frontier defense, castle management, and the wider military geography of the Reconquista, which still mattered deeply in Iberia. In Iberia, crusading was not only a memory of the Levant, because it still touched real borders, real warfare, and real Christian state interests. Destroying the Templars in Portugal would not simply satisfy a papal decree, but would rip out a functioning military network inside a frontier kingdom. The church itself had long supported military orders precisely because they joined monastic legitimacy with warfare in defense of Latin Christian interests. That made total erasure awkward, because Rome was being pushed to destroy a machine it had once helped bless, while some of Europe still needed the machine's function. Portugal could therefore argue with real force that this was not a place for blind copying, because castles, trained men, and organized defense could not be thrown away casually. This is where papal motive starts becoming clearer, because the Pope needed peace with France, but also needed crusading resources to remain useful where crusading reality had not ended. The next clue appears in the fight over property, because land and money often reveal what rulers and popes actually want preserved. After the suppression, Clement V issued the bull Ad Providam, which broadly transferred former Templar property to the Hospitallers. On paper that sounds simple, but Iberia was never simple, because Templar assets that were tied to local defense, local politics, and frontier geography. Portugal argued that these castles, lands, and incomes were not only valuable wealth, but also pieces of a strategic system built for local military use. If those assets simply flowed outward under a one-size-fits-all rule, Portugal could lose direct control over tools that mattered to royal security. That argument served Dinis, but it also served a deeper church concern, because Rome wanted military endowments to stay in crusading use instead of drifting into waste or chaos. The papacy had little reason to watch proven frontier infrastructure die if the same land and income could remain inside an orthodox military channel. This is why the Portuguese exception was not soft mercy, because it solved a problem created by the clash between a universal decree and local military need. Still, usefulness alone was not enough, because the old Templar name had become politically toxic after the French campaign turned the order itself into a public scandal. So Rome needed a second move more subtle than simple refusal, and that move was transformation without open contradiction. The elegant solution was institutional laundering: suppress the old order, bury the dangerous name, disperse the scandal, and allow the useful parts to return under cleaner supervision. In Portugal, that new body became the Order of Christ, formally approved in 1319 by Pope John XII through the bull Ad Ex Quibus. That date matters because it shows sequence, with the temple first dying as a public institution and a safer replacement then appearing to carry selected functions forward. This was not the papacy reversing itself in embarrassment, but managing an afterlife for Templar resources that no longer carried the old Templar label. The men, the wealth, the land, and the discipline did not have to vanish if the politically dangerous corporate body was gone. The old shell could die while the useful core survived, and that is exactly what made Portugal so important. This is why the story is not really about mercy in a sentimental sense, because it is about papal pragmatism under heavy pressure. Clement V had to juggle French intimidation, church prestige, legal doubt, crusading ideology, property disputes, and the simple practical problem of what to do with trained warrior monks. Portugal offered a path that reduced conflict on several fronts at the same time, which is why it became acceptable. Rome could maintain that the temple was suppressed, while Portugal kept the military capital it considered necessary to its survival. Notice how clever that compromise was, because nobody needed to announce that the Templars had actually been mostly fine all along. The church only had to approve a controlled replacement, and the replacement could carry continuity without carrying the same scandal. King Dinis also handled this carefully, because he did not stage a loud rebellion against papal authority and instead pressed for reclassification. That strategy let both sides save face, with Rome keeping legal authority and Portugal keeping trained men, fortified sites, and military usefulness. Another important clue comes from the Chinon proceedings, because they reveal that Clement V's own attitude toward leading Templars was more complex than a simple story of total damnation. In those proceedings, the Pope showed willingness to reconcile leading Templars sacramentally after confession instead of treating them as permanent outcasts beyond all remedy. That does not mean the Pope declared the order innocent, but it does show that papal thinking still had room for absolution and reintegration. Once that detail is understood, Portugal's outcome makes much more sense, because the biggest obstacle was not that every Templar soul had to be destroyed. The real obstacle was that the original order had become politically explosive, especially under the pressure created by Philip IV. In other words, spiritual repair and institutional survival were still thinkable, but only after the old public form had been sacrificed. The French center of the crisis matters again here, because the harshest and most theatrical anti-Templar action happened where royal debt and power politics were strongest. Portugal sat farther from that heat, and Portuguese rulers had benefited from the Templars instead of needing a spectacular prosecution. Because local motives were different, Rome had more room to compromise there without openly undoing the wider suppression. What looks like a strange exception begins to look like a regional strategy once geography, frontier need, and political pressure are placed together. The early structure of the new order supports that reading, because the Order of Christ was first centered at Castromarum, before later becoming strongly linked with Tomar. That first center matters because Castromarum was a frontier position, and frontier placement points towards strategic reuse rather than romantic memory. A frontier base says more than a legend, because it shows that both church and crown were thinking about active defense and controlled service. Tomar later became the famous symbol, but the founding logic already pointed toward the real motive, which was preserving utility under a new name. From Rome's point of view, that meant zeal, manpower, land, and discipline could stay inside an approved religious framework. From Portugal's point of view, it prevented a dangerous loss of castles, incomes, and trained men that had already proven useful in war. From a broader political point of view, it reduced the risk that former Templar resources would scatter, be secularized, or become a source of instability. That three-sided advantage explains why the compromise held, because it solved several connected problems without forcing either side into open defeat. The Pope did not need Portugal weakened, and the Portuguese king did not need Rome publicly humiliated, so both could live with a formula that buried the old badge. This is why the real motive was controlled continuity dressed in legal change rather than emotional attachment to the Templars. Once that frame is in place, many scattered details begin to fit together as parts of one design instead of isolated oddities. Vox, in excelso, ended the temple as the temple, ad providam managed property, and ad ex quibus authorized the new solution through the Order of Christ. Those documents do not tell a story of chaos, but a story of legal engineering under severe political stress. The papacy could appear firm in public while behaving flexibly in practice, and that balance protected church credibility while saving useful frontier capacity. There was also a religious motive hidden inside the political one, because the church still cared about crusading purpose in a region where frontier struggle remained real. Military orders were not decorative institutions in Iberia, but part of how Christian power was organized, defended, and justified. To destroy one order completely without replacing its function would have created a gap in a landscape where the church still claimed sacred military purpose. So the Portuguese settlement did more than protect King Dinis and more than soothe local elites, because it also protected the church's own long-term project in the peninsula. This is why total destruction was religiously unnecessary in Portugal once the scandalous corporation itself had been dissolved. The papacy did not need every wall abandoned or every knight dispersed, and instead needed scandal managed, authority preserved, and frontier service kept inside supervision. That combination is the heart of the motive angle, because Rome was not sparing the Templars out of weakness and was deciding which part had to die and which part could live. The International Order of the Temple had become a political burden too large to defend, while the military capacity carried by that order was still too useful to waste everywhere. Portugal was the place where those two facts could be joined without direct contradiction, and that is why the survival there feels carefully designed rather than accidental. Think about the alternatives, because they show why the chosen path made sense for Rome, for Dinis, and for frontier defense. If Rome had insisted on total erasure in Portugal, it risked weaker frontier defense, harsher conflict with Dinis, and the waste of wealth already shaped for crusading use. If Rome had openly saved the Templars under the old name, it risked outrage, legal confusion, and a deeper struggle with France. The middle path avoided both extremes, because the old order died while the useful system returned in a safer legal body. That is the core of the political theology in this story, because power was used not through a simple yes or no, but through redefinition of survival itself. The Pope could suppress and preserve at the same time as long as each act happened at a different institutional level. The temple as a brand and corporate body was expendable, while the temple as trained manpower, wealth, fortification, and frontier mission was not. That is why the Portugal case fascinates historians, because it reveals a papacy capable of being ruthless and flexible in the very same decision. Publicly, the papacy joined the wider suppression, yet quietly accepted a path that kept the military engine running where that engine still served Christian state interests. This also explains why later memory can mislead people when the story is told mainly through buildings like Tomar. If the story is framed through one fortress, survival can look like a local mystery of place, but if it is framed through motive, it becomes a decision built from converging needs. The deeper evidence is not one famous wall, but the pattern linking papal pressure, frontier necessity, property policy, and the birth of the Order of Christ. Each piece alone suggests compromise, and together they show deliberate design rather than accident, confusion, or simple mercy. Even the language of exception can hide the truth, because Portugal was not merely lucky, and instead sat inside the one kind of environment where controlled survival made sense. That environment had castles to hold, borders to guard, and religious legitimacy to maintain, so it could not treat military orders as dead luggage from the east. The Levant helped shape Templar fame, but Iberia shaped the Templars' afterlife, because the frontier function still breathed there. This is also why the new order mattered more than its title, because the Order of Christ was the mechanism that turned scandalous memory into usable continuity. Once former Templar resources lived inside that mechanism, they were no longer an embarrassing remnant, and became an authorized instrument under cleaner oversight. That shift from remnant to instrument is the key to the whole mystery, because it explains how survival became possible without public reversal. The story also reminds us that medieval institutions were rarely destroyed by moral language alone, because wealth, manpower, geography, and timing always shaped what justice looked like. Philip IV wanted one kind of outcome in France, King Dinis needed another in Portugal, and the papacy stood between them, building a formula each side could survive. So when people ask whether the Pope let the Templars survive in Portugal, the best answer is yes, but only after changing what survival meant. He did not save the temple as the temple, and he allowed continuity only after the old name and structure had been stripped away. That distinction is not a small technical note, because it is the whole trick behind the Portuguese exception. Without that trick, Rome risked either looking weak before France or behaving foolishly on a still important Iberian frontier. With that trick, Rome could claim order while preserving utility, and that is a very different kind of power from simple force. The Portuguese crown understood this well, because asking for a new form was easier for the papacy to grant than open defiance on behalf of the old one. The result was not an accidental survival hidden in a corner of Europe, but a negotiated settlement built on mutual need. Seen this way, the Portuguese exception becomes less like a romantic conspiracy tale and more like a very medieval masterpiece of managed continuity. Names changed, legal formulas changed, and seals changed, but men, lands, and military purpose did not vanish into dust. That is why the papacy allowed the path, because total destruction was politically costly, strategically inconvenient, and religiously unnecessary, where crusading function still mattered. The international scandal had to disappear, but the frontier machinery in Portugal did not disappear with it after suppression. Once those two goals are separated, the story becomes clearer, because Rome was sorting Templar poison from military usefulness. The poison was the Templar corporation under a ruined public image, while the usefulness was organized military capacity still valuable to Christian rule in Iberia. Portugal gave the papacy a safe place to bury one and preserve the other, and that is the real motive behind the survival. One more detail sharpens the picture, because keeping former Templar assets under local control also limited the chance that outside orders would gain too much leverage inside Portugal. That mattered to Dinis because military land was not only about defense, and also about who commanded rents, roads, men, and fortified space. Rome could accept that concern because a stable Portuguese kingdom still served wider Christian interests better than a bitter property struggle. The compromise therefore protected papal goals by respecting local realities instead of pretending every kingdom had the same political weather as France. Even the word survival can confuse the issue, because what survived was less a disgraced institution than a bundle of assets, trained people, disciplined habits, castles, and revenue streams. Medieval kings and popes understood that bundles like that were too valuable to destroy carelessly, because they were tools of war, order, and legitimacy at the same time. The Church had spent generations authorizing these forms of holy warfare, so abolishing one order did not mean abandoning the entire system that made such orders useful. Portugal became the clearest test case, showing that the wider system could absorb scandal by changing form instead of losing function. That is why the Order of Christ should not be seen as a sentimental rescue boat, because it was a replacement engine installed inside the same strategic machine. The old engine name had been disgraced, but the route, the cargo, and much of the crew still had value. Once that image becomes clear, the papal choice stops looking soft and starts looking efficient after the French crisis. Harsher punishment might have pleased some enemies, but it would also have weakened a frontier ally and wasted resources already shaped for crusading work. Open reversal would have weakened papal authority, because it would seem that Rome had condemned the order and then quickly abandoned its own judgment. The middle solution preserved the appearance of consistency, while quietly protecting the substance of military utility in Portugal. That is why historians call the outcome pragmatic, because pragmatism here did not mean weak belief and instead meant choosing a workable institutional form under severe pressure. In that sense, Portugal did not escape history and instead revealed it, because the kingdom showed how papal decisions were shaped by borders, assets, alliances, and needs on the ground. So why did the Pope let the Templars survive in Portugal? Because what had to die was the scandal-ridden International Order of the Temple as a political problem. What could still live was the military capacity behind it once that capacity had been renamed, supervised, and folded into a new order. That answer carries more suspense than any stone legend, because it shows power working through law, faith, and necessity at the same time. It also matters that Rome could treat Iberia differently without publicly saying France had been wrong, because the papacy often used local solutions inside universal language. A universal decree could still produce regional outcomes when political and military conditions were not the same from kingdom to kingdom. That flexibility was not medieval weakness, but a normal way of ruling a wide Christian world filled with different pressures. Portugal's Templars had been useful administrators of castles and frontier lands, so continued service under a new banner looked practical instead of reckless. The papacy also avoided another danger by approving transformation, because unsupervised former Templar resources could have tempted secular seizure and local disorder. A supervised new order kept those resources inside church-approved discipline instead of letting them become scattered private spoils. That point matters because control was always part of the motive, and transformation gave Rome more control than either total destruction or open rescue. Total destruction wastes assets. Open rescue invites scandal, and controlled rebirth balances authority with usefulness under papal control. Seen that way, the Portuguese exception was not a loophole in the system, and was one of the system's smartest repairs. The Order of Christ let Rome say the temple was gone while still ensuring that trained men and fortified property served approved Christian goals. Even the later fame of Tomar can distract from this, because people remember the stone symbol and forget the legal choreography that made the symbol possible. But that legal choreography is the real plot. Suppress, reassign, negotiate, approve, and redirect resources carefully across the kingdom. Each step removed public danger from the old corporation while protecting practical military strength on the Portuguese ground. This is also why the case feels conspiratorial to modern viewers, because the papacy publicly condemned and privately preserved at different levels. Yet the better word is pragmatic, because the policy solved a frontier problem without tearing papal authority apart. Medieval institutions often survived by changing outer form, and the Templars in Portugal are one of the clearest examples. The old order could not survive unchanged, but its function could survive translated into a new order, a new name, and a new legal shell. That translated survival is the heart of the mystery, and once you see it, the Portuguese exception stops looking accidental. That is why the papacy could look severe on paper and selective in practice without feeling inconsistent to medieval rulers. Paper ended the temple, but policy preserved frontier function where that same function still served Christian interests in Iberia. Portugal's case shows that an institution can die legally while surviving operationally under another approved and supervised name. For Rome, that was the cleanest way to honor the suppression while avoiding the waste of assets built for Christian war. For Dinis, it meant obedience without self-harm, because he could satisfy papal authority without stripping his kingdom of proven defenses. The papacy was not choosing between total honesty and secret betrayal, but between clumsy rigidity and useful adaptation. For historians, that motive trail reveals more than any legend about hidden Templars, because it shows exactly why survival under a new order made political sense. Seen one last time from above, the papacy destroyed the scandal, saved the frontier utility, and used a new order to keep those two goals from colliding. If this motive trail grabbed you, the next video should be on how Philip IV used debt, fear, and royal pressure to bring down one of the strongest orders in medieval Europe.